Good day. Today is Wednesday, 12th February 2025, and events continue to gather pace in the United States. We've had pictures of Donald Trump and Elon Musk together, and it looks as if Elon Musk has been given more authority from the president to enlarge his investigations of the federal bureaucracy in Washington, and this continues to play out, and it continues, by the way, to result in a lot of criticism, a lot of complaints that much of what is being done is illegal. People talk about a constitutional crisis, about a coup, all of these things, but the locomotive, if you like, of change in Washington seems to propel forward regardless. There was an interesting article in the Financial Times by Edward Luce, a commentator who is deeply critical of Donald Trump, in which he essentially admitted that in this particular battle that is taking place at the moment in Washington, Trump and Musk seem to have the initiative and the momentum, and that the opposition to them continues to be deeply disorganized and, importantly, unpopular with the American people. Anyway, I am not going to discuss this in this program because I'm going to focus for the moment on the emerging process of extricating the United States from the debacle which is the Biden administration's project in Ukraine. I think those words that I've used are a fair summary of what is going on. I think that the United States, or at least the Trump administration, has not yet worked out fully its plan about how to go about doing this, but that is their objective. It is to try and extricate the United States from a Project Ukraine, which the Trump people see alternatively as a failed business venture and as a geopolitical debacle. And of course, in a sense, it is both. Now, we have had certain further indicators of what is going on, of the ultimate trends that are asserting themselves on the part of the Trump administration of what it is doing. Now, firstly, there has been an exchange with the Russians of two prisoners. A Russian prisoner held in the United States, a spy, has been exchanged for an American spy, a Mr. Fogel, who has been received by Donald Trump in, I believe, the White House. There's pictures of him with an American flag, that's to say Mr. Fogel, with an American flag draped around him. Trump said some very favorable and conciliatory things about the Russians, about how Russia had treated the United States nicely over the affair. I gather that Mr. Fogel has confirmed that he was treated well and properly by the Russians when he was in detention. Now, these exchanges take place all the time. A couple of days ago, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press spokesman, spoke about how contacts had intensified between various agencies. I speculated yesterday that the alleged telephone calls between Putin and Trump might have been some of these agencies that Peskov was talking about. But it looks as if there is now, since John Radcliffe was appointed CIA director, there's definitely been a resumption of contacts between the American intelligence community and the Russian intelligence community, and the spy swap to exchange captured agents has proceeded and has now taken place. And I suspect that when Peskov talked about contacts between agencies, contacts between the CIA and the SVR, between Russian intelligence and American intelligence, was part of what he was talking about. But putting all that aside, the fact that there are these contacts, that these contacts have now resumed, the fact that Mr. Fogel is now back in the United States and his Russian opposite number is back in Russia, the most important thing to take away from this exchange is the warm language used by Donald Trump and Mr. Fogel himself, and the sense of an improving, warming relationship that those words about Russia conveyed. And the Russians undoubtedly will have picked up on those words, and they will have noticed them, and they will be saying to themselves that yes, it does look as if Donald Trump does indeed want to achieve an improvement in relations. It's a small thing, but small visible gestures of this kind can have an effect on the general atmosphere. And for the record, I get the sense that the general atmosphere between the Americans and the Russians is warming, even though the Russians remain confused about a lot of what the administration is up to. And as I said yesterday, have pushed back strongly on the threats and bribes that they were getting from Kellogg and others. Anyway, the Russians will have picked up that these warm words were said, and they'll be saying to themselves, well, clearly the Trump administration continues to be a work in progress, but it is a work in progress which is heading in the right direction, at least for the moment. And this contrasts with a somewhat more chilly take, as far as I can see, on the contacts between the Americans and the Ukrainians. Now, the new US Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bessent, is apparently heading to Kiev, and J.D. Vance is also due to meet with Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky. There have been contacts already, I understand. And of course, J.D. Vance has been attending some kind of big AI meeting about AI in Paris. He's had meetings with Macron, the French president, who perhaps unintentionally snubbed Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He walked past Modi without shaking his hand during a group session, which I understand has not gone down well in India. I can't imagine that Macron intended to do that. It's another sign of Macron's lack of understanding of how diplomacy is conducted and his occasional arrogance and tactlessness. But anyway, this has been an interesting summit in itself, but AI is absolutely not my area of expertise. I suspect, by the way, that there are excessive expectations on what it will do. I'm going to skip all the contacts that have happened there. The point is that Mr. Bessent and J.D. Vance, following the lead from Donald Trump, are apparently demanding that the Ukrainians open their books and explain to the United States what has happened to all the hundreds of billions of dollars of money that the United States has been funneling to Ukraine. And Zelensky himself, of course, a couple of days ago, said that he cannot account for $100 billion of that money. And I wonder what the Americans, when they meet with Zelensky, will say about that. I suspect that these encounters between Zelensky and the Americans over the next couple of days, and not just, of course, Zelensky, but other Ukrainian officials will also be meeting the Americans. I suspect that these are going to be very uncomfortable encounters. This administration Well, however things eventually turn out, is for the moment very much focused on getting value for money, and at least that's their rhetoric. And to say it frankly, Ukraine has not provided much in the way of value. I spoke yesterday in my programme about how there's been a shift in Donald Trump's own rhetoric on the question of Ukraine's mineral wealth. Previously, in his initial comments, he had been talking about Ukraine providing the United States with its mineral wealth, access to its mineral wealth, in order to fund future arms deliveries from the United States. Now, Donald Trump, and I suspect Bessent and Vance, are coming to the Ukrainians and they're saying, where's our money? And if you can't pay it back, can you give us our mineral wealth, your mineral wealth, in return for all the money and all the weapons and all of the other things that we have been giving you up to now? So, the mineral wealth is now repayment for assistance previously given, instead of being, if you like, security for assistance that is going to be given in the future. It's an interesting shift. I don't know how seriously it is intended, but again, it is going to make the Ukrainians uncomfortable, especially so as most of that mineral wealth, or much of it, is out of their reach. It is out under Russian control. And as the Ukrainian media has already pointed out, much of it is already owned by various third parties. And in order to make it available to the Americans, those third parties would have to be divested of it in some way, and that might not be straightforward. Now, I said that the Russians are following and watching and monitoring all of this, and they are. And there's been an interesting article in Vedomosti, a Russian newspaper, which, by the way, was originally set up back in the 1990s as part of a partnership by the Pearson Group in Britain, once owners of the Financial Times and The Economist, and the Wall Street Journal in the United States. Vedomosti was of a Western established financial newspaper in Russia. I believe for a time, and perhaps still, it used pink paper as the Financial Times in London does. Just saying. Anyway, Vedomosti still is one of Russia's leading business newspapers, but it has long since passed fully under Russian control, and its perspectives today are profoundly different from what they were when it was first established in the late 1990s. It is still, however, an important newspaper in Russia. Anyway, this is the summary of an article in Vedomosti about the state of the negotiations and about the trajectory of travel of the United States, of the administration, in terms of its negotiating strategy, which Vedomosti has published. This summary comes from TASS. The team of US President Donald Trump has once again delayed the unveiling of its plans to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. It maintains that Trump will receive the final version in a few weeks after consultations with his European allies. And that, of course, we know is now taking place. US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, is scheduled to present Trump with a plan in the near future, Bloomberg reported, citing sources. Several hours before that, the Daily Telegraph reported Kellogg's supposed decision to pause the development of the initiative until consultations with European NATO allies. And then we have the more interesting part of the article. Trump and his team have faced the harsh reality which does not align with their 2024 preliminary drafts. And that, of course, is an allusion to Kellogg's article of April 2024, when he first set out his original ideas of how to end the conflict, which basically were to delay Ukraine's NATO entry for 20 years, freeze the conflict, introduce European peacekeepers, and hope that that would be accepted by the Russians. Anyway, Trump and his team had faced the harsh reality which does not align with their 2024 preliminary drafts. Dmitry Suslov, Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Security at the Higher School of Economics, has said. Kellogg's plan envisaged a truce, elections in Ukraine, and the continuation of talks. This is practically impossible, given that Russia is not prepared to freeze the conflict, while Zelensky is reluctant to hold elections because it would likely result in his political downfall, Suslov said. Suslov stressed that Trump will use any leverage on Russia to force it into talks on his terms. If his plan fails, he will attempt to shift the responsibility of supporting the Kiev regime onto the Europeans. Trump is testing the waters, hence the seemingly contradictory moves such as pressuring Ukraine on territorial issues, demanding elections, and putting pressure on Russia through promises of continued arms supplies to the Kiev regime. Dmitry Novikov, an associate professor at the Department of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics, has said. Now, I don't know Novikov, but I should disclose that I have, in the past, long ago, had a brief encounter with Mr. Suslov, and I gained the impression then that he was indeed an extremely well-informed and well-connected person in Russian foreign policy circles. So what the Russians are saying here is that Trump's people have now had their first encounters with the Russians, and that they now realize that Kellogg's original ideas, those set out in his article of April 2024, are unrealistic, they are unachievable, and they're now trying to come up with a negotiating strategy that they can take forward with the Russians and with the Ukrainians as well. And that negotiating strategy involves elections in Ukraine, which, of course, will see the end of Vladimir Zelensky. However, the Americans are starting to understand that they have no real leverage over the Russians. And rather than press forward with all the threats and bribes that they've been making over the last couple of days, threats of outright, all-encompassing economic war, which are unrealistic and which would be catastrophically counterproductive if they were ever applied, are now recognizing that the various bribes to lift sanctions, allow the Nord Stream pipeline to be reactivated, all that kind of thing, rather than, now that they're realizing that the threats and the bribes won't work with the Russians, the Trump people are starting to tell themselves, well, maybe the ultimate way is to shift, this is Suslov's words, the responsibility of supporting the Kiev regime onto the Europeans so that the United States can in effect walk away. And I think we are increasingly seeing that that is exactly what is happening. Mike Waltz has now said that the United States will not be giving security guarantees to Ukraine, so I understand him to mean, and I'm sure that this is true. The Pete Hegseth has transferred chairmanship of the Ramstein Group to the British Defence Secretary, John Healey. The Americans are coming to Ukraine, asking about what has happened to their money. That makes it, so it seems to me, all but impossible that the Americans, the Trump administration, will come back to Congress and ask for a further appropriation to support Ukraine, given that the Ukrainians are not going to be able to account for all the money. They have already admitted as much, given that there are apparently going to be investigations into the United States, inside the United States itself, to find out what has happened to much of this money during the time of the Biden administration, given that there is a small possibility that we might even see prosecutions over all of this. How does the Trump administration come back to Congress and ask for more money to send to Ukraine or to fund the war in Ukraine, given that billions of dollars have already gone astray and cannot be accounted for? I don't think that this can happen. So I think that the Trump people are going to eventually say to the Europeans, the United States has given all that it can. It's spent all that it can. A lot of the money has disappeared. The Americans are not fools. There's that famous quote, that famous quip, that a fool will always be parted from his money. Donald Trump does not want to be considered that kind of fool. He has said as much. He is not going to throw more good money after bad money. At least that is the rhetoric that the administration is applying for the moment. And personally, I take this seriously. Now, there's been further signs that within the administration, the drift in decisions and appointments is increasingly moving in the direction of those people who are skeptical of further support and investment in Project Ukraine. Now, there's been an article in a site called Semaphore, which I confess I've never come across before, but which does seem to be well connected with the MAGA side of the Trump movement. Anyway, it claims, it's appearing today, it claims that there's been a battle for influence within the Trump team, and that within that battle for influence, members of Trump's family or extended family have also been involved, and the Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., is winning out over Jared Kushner, who was the most influential advisor on foreign policy from within Trump's family in Donald Trump's first term. Now, Kushner is assumed by many people, probably correctly, to be more conventional in his thinking, whereas Donald Trump Jr. is said to be more closely aligned with the MAGA movement and with that aspect of the Trump team, the one that wants to take a much more hard-nosed, much more critical approach to foreign policy. And apparently, and this is all taken from this particular article, it's titled, by the way, is "In the Family Business of Foreign Policy, Donald Trump Jr. Displaces Jared Kushner." And the article is written by someone called Ben Smith, whom I don't know. But anyway, the article then goes on to say that the appointment which has defined this conflict or alleged conflict between Trump Jr. and Kushner is the appointment of Eldridge Colby to a senior position within the Pentagon. And Colby, of course, has written pieces in the Financial Times, and he's appeared on Tucker Carlson, and he is backed by Donald Trump Jr., according to this article. And the article says that Colby's broad argument is that the United States is overextended and needs to reduce its commitments in Europe and the Middle East in order to ramp up its presence in Asia and avoid war with China. But he's faced a low-grade insurgency in Washington from the overlapping circle of hawks and allies of Israel, including a prominent group who wrote a previously unreported letter to senators this month, raising serious concerns about his nomination. Now Colby's allies are reassuring senators who must confirm him to the position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy that he supports strong US backing for Israel and that he's not personally responsible for the appointment of more strident critics of American power to Pentagon and State Department roles. And then there's a long discussion about Colby's appointment, which I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to. I think it is more likely than not, by the way, that Colby will be confirmed. For the moment, Donald Trump seems to be getting his way with confirmations. The Republican Party in the Senate appears to be holding together, and it looks as if both Robert Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard will be confirmed. Just saying. So I presume and hope and expect that Mr. Colby will be confirmed. And the reason I hope he will be confirmed is that whatever his stance is towards China, it does seem to me that Colby, along with Vance and Gabbard and Hegseth and all of the others, are basically very critical about the forever wars and the conflicts in Europe, in the Middle East, against Russia, which I also think it is in the interests of the United States to wind down. So anyway, there we go. Now, I don't know that there is, as I said, really an actual conflict between Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner. But certainly my overall sense is that the trend in appointments and the bias in the president's own thinking is leading him increasingly in that direction. So this is where I think events are taking us. Now, having said all of this, that then brings us back to the vexed question about whether any kind of negotiation with the Russians about Ukraine or any other topic is even worthwhile. And there has been a very powerful and very insightful article on this issue by Eve Smith in Naked Capitalism, which discusses this whole question of negotiations. And I think I can summarize the article, I hope I'm summarizing it fairly, by saying that E. Smith is skeptical about whether a successful negotiation between the Russians and the Americans is possible. And she is also skeptical that the Russians ultimately have any real belief in the prospects of such a negotiation. And she makes the point, and it is an absolutely valid point, that there's been an endless pattern of deception and duplicity, at least from a Russian perspective, in their interconnections with the United States, going back many years. Though I don't think she actually says this in the article itself. I remember that even during the Obama administration, the Russians were already saying at that time that they considered the United States to be agreement incapable, that any agreement that the Russians made with the Americans on any issue was almost automatically going to be argued about and renegotiated within the United States itself as soon as it was made, and that inevitably meant that sooner or later the deal, whatever agreement with the Russians had been reached, would be set aside. And you can see that the whole structure of agreements, all of the treaties, the arms control treaties that had been appeared to have been agreed during the period of détente in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it all began to fall apart after George W. Bush pulled the United States out of the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Then that trend accelerated during Donald Trump's first term, when John Bolton persuaded Trump to pull out of the INF Treaty and the Open Skies Agreement. Obama gave the Russians to think that the United States would not proceed with the project of installing anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Europe. On that basis, the Russians agreed to move forward with another START treaty. They then discovered that the United States would in fact install anti-ballistic missile systems in Romania and Poland. It's impossible to underestimate, by the way, the degree of anger that there is in Russia about that, and their feeling that the whole business of installing anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Romania and Poland is in fact simply a device to establish launchers in those two countries from which intermediate nuclear missiles directed at Russia will eventually be installed. And then, of course, there's the promises about not extending NATO eastwards, which were never honoured. The agreements that the Russians come back to constantly about the fact that all states in Europe would agree to equal and equivalent security, that no state would seek to establish its security at the expense of another state. And the Russians say that, in fact, the Americans went back on all of that, that they continuously prioritized their own security, the security of their allies, over Russia's, and sacrificed Russian security interests to that obsession. So the Russians feel angry about that. And then there is the terrible story of the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. The Russian ambassador to Belarus, Boris Gryzlov, a well-connected Russian, former member of the Security Council, former negotiator on issues relating to Ukraine. He's made more bitter points, which you can read in TASS, about the duplicity that the Russians faced in connection with the Minsk agreements and how they were never honoured. The Ukrainians had no intention of complying with them. The Americans and the British set out to undermine them. The Germans and the French looked the other way and aided and abetted the Ukrainians as they went behind them. So the Russians, exactly as Eve Smith correctly says, are now deeply, deeply skeptical and mistrustful of any possible negotiations between the Americans and indeed the Western powers and themselves. Overcoming this distrust is going to be a massive challenge. And to quote the key paragraphs in Eve Smith's article, she makes the point that the Russians have now repeatedly set out this long, troubled, unhappy history in many speeches and articles and commentaries made by Putin, Lavrov, and other officials. And she says this: the very short version of the argument is that top Russian officials, most visibly Putin, have taken to regularly and in very long form describing the US and Western record of duplicity, not just with Ukraine, but on other fronts. This line of commentary has only become more pointed and the bill of particulars of Western treachery longer. This means the Russians are clearly, repeatedly and consistently saying any agreement with the West would be worthless. The obvious implication isn't simply that there would be nothing to gain in signing one, but that it would be self-destructive to do so, since it would give Russia a false sense of security that the West would exploit, as it has done again and again and again. In other words, all of the focus on the content of a potential agreement misses the elephant in the room. The content is almost irrelevant. Russians cannot get a process by which the perfidious West can be made trustworthy. Now, that is a very compelling and a very powerful argument. By the way, it's an argument that is often made on threads to this video, to the videos that you see on these channels, and it may indeed come to precisely that. The Russians will listen to what the Trump people are saying, but they will say to Trump, they will say to Kellogg, on the assumption that they eventually meet with him, they will say to Rubio, they will say to Mike Waltz, well, look, we've heard all this before. We've had all of these promises made in the past. We've been given all kinds of secure guarantees. We made treaties with you. The ABM treaty and the INF treaty were treaties, and you've gone back on all of those. So how do you expect us now to come back after all of that and reach another agreement with you over Ukraine or indeed anything else? And I'm going to say further that Eve Smith, in this same article, is sceptical that there has in fact been a discussion, a conversation between Trump and Putin. She says that she reads Peskov's words somewhat differently than I do. She thinks that Peskov is basically saying, well, the Americans may be saying that there's been a conversation, and I'm not going to confirm it, but, well, if you really want to believe that there has been such a conversation, that's up to you, but I know otherwise. I think, again, that's a fair summary of Eve Smith's take on Peskov's words. Anyway, she's skeptical that there has indeed been a conversation between Putin and Trump. And she also says that she thinks it is all but inconceivable, in fact, that it is inconceivable, that the United States would be willing to engage with the Russians seriously about the general security architecture in Europe, and that the Russians know this. So this is, as I said, a compelling article. You can find it in Naked Capitalism, and I think it is one that is absolutely worth reading. Nonetheless, I am going to make a number of points here, not exactly in argument with this article, which, as I said, may very well turn out to be absolutely correct. Overcoming the depth of suspicion and the level of mistrust is going to be extraordinarily difficult, and it may prove to be impossible. But I am going to say this, and to some extent this goes back to a previous point that Eve Smith has also made, which I believe to be true, and which the Russians themselves are saying is true, which is that in the absence of an agreement with the United States, the Russians are going to have, and it has to be ultimately, I should make it clear, the United States. The Russians could be facing long-term problems in Ukraine because they can occupy all of eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River. They can push beyond the Dnieper River and occupy large territories in central Ukraine, including Kiev itself. They can push further west still and establish control of western Ukraine also. But what then? Putting aside the question of whether a government in exile, a Ukrainian government in exile, will be set up in the West, I think in that scenario, by the way, it quite plausibly would be, just saying, and I think it could quite plausibly be established in London. I understand that there was actual discussion about that in Britain way back in 2022. Well, putting all that aside, putting aside whether the Russians really would face an insurgency in central and western Ukraine, I think they would, but I think that they would quite rapidly get on top of it. There would still, in that kind of scenario, be major problems for the Russians going forward. Firstly, it's very difficult to imagine that the Western powers would ever accept that outcome to the war. So the Russians would be left in control of a vast territory in Ukraine, absent Western recognition. The West would say that the Russians are in illegal occupation of essentially the entire territory of Europe's second largest country. And that would create a long-term conflict in Europe, a conflict which would be inherently destabilizing and which would oblige the Russians to maintain powerful forces in Western Europe, or rather in Ukraine and on their western borders, and which would propel the Russians into a long-term confrontation with the West and with the United States that might go on for decades. Now, to be very clear, I believe that if the Russians decide that that is the only way that they can achieve security on their western borders, they would probably do it. But I don't think it is an attractive prospect to them, just as I do not think it would be an attractive prospect for the United States or for Europe generally. It would create a long-term crisis in Europe, and one which, unless the United States were prepared to abandon Europe to its fate, would oblige the United States to maintain powerful forces in Europe, whereas everything coming out of the United States, coming out of the Trump administration, says that for the moment, the US wants to refocus its energies on China instead. I mean, that is what Eldridge Colby and Steve Bannon, by the way, not that he's a part of the administration, but Eldridge Colby and others are saying. So, given that that is so, I would have thought that the Russians would still want some kind of deal with the Americans. It would probably be a fairly limited deal, but it would be a deal which would, at least from a Russian perspective, provide some kind of stability for their western borders, one which would avoid that kind of perpetual conflict which the Russians would face. And obviously that deal would be extremely difficult to negotiate for all the reasons that Eve Smith and others have set out. But I think that if the Russians could find a way to come to such an agreement with things in place, situation in place, which they felt could secure that agreement for the long term, then I think they might go for it. And it might be in the US interest to go for it as well. Now, I'm not going to try and negotiate what that kind of deal would be in advance. I think the Russians would strongly object to the presence of European troops in any part of Ukraine, just saying. I think the Russians would, by now, strongly object to US guarantees in any form to Ukraine. And the Trump administration, by the way, doesn't seem to be keen to give those guarantees. In fact, Mike Waltz said that the United States won't do that. But the Russians will not only insist on that, they will want significant reductions in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think looking forward in terms of any potential agreement, I suspect that the Russians would insist on some kind of Russian presence in whatever state in Ukraine were to remain independent going forward as well. So that might mean an official Russian presence, maybe even a military presence in places like Odessa, Nikolaev, Kiev, who knows. That would not be an easy thing to negotiate. It would certainly encounter enormous opposition from some people in Europe and in Ukraine. And it might eventually, by the way, if the Russians were to achieve that kind of leverage in Ukraine as well, it might in time result in a drift of Ukraine back into the Russian sphere. But would that still not be a better outcome for the United States than a prolonged, permanent confrontation with the Russians in Europe? Just saying. Now, as I said, I don't want to suggest, I'm not setting out here the conditions for a settlement. That's not for me to do. The Russians and the Americans can talk with each other and they can agree with each other whatever they like. I'm just saying that I still think that there is room for the Russians and the Americans to talk to each other, though I am not certain, if they do, that will come to any kind of outcome. And if it doesn't, and if we do get to the position where the Americans decide that they have no real option but to walk away, then I think that they will do so, and that they will indeed dump it all onto the hands of the Europeans. And at that point, the Europeans will undoubtedly fail. And then we will see how the war ends and how far west the Russians decide to go. Because at that point, it will be the Russians who will have to make that decision basically by themselves. I think that is the most likely outcome to this conflict. But as I said, I would not personally completely exclude the possibility of the Americans and the Russians talking to each other and perhaps coming to some kind of long-term understanding, even if it is not one that can be set out in a formal treaty. Now, over the last couple of days, in fact, about 2 weeks, the Russians have increasingly been talking about the 1945 Yalta agreement. In fact, they, as I recall now, some Russian commentators were talking about the need for a new Yalta between themselves and the Americans, starting from about a year ago. And I think that is code for the sort of understanding that I have basically set between themselves and the Americans, that I have set out in this video. Now, I say all of this. I don't know who is listening to these programs. I've been hearing all kinds of rumors and telltale claims about all sorts of people in Washington and London and Paris and Moscow who listen to these programs. I have very, very little. In fact, I have no evidence of this apart from one or two people who've come forward and said that they listen to these programs. Anyway, if they want my thoughts, if anybody is listening in Washington and Moscow, well, I've set out here my own views about how these discussions, if they do take place, can work, and what the potential outcome might be if they don't. To repeat again, if this situation is just left to play itself out, and if the Russians decide that there is no way that they can fully secure their western borders except by occupying the whole of Ukraine, including places like Lvov, I think the Russians will do it. And I think, contrary to what some people believe, I think the Russians have the capabilities to do it and are coming closer to that point. I don't think, in their own interests, that is what the Russians want. I think all of this talk about a new Yalta from the Russians is intended as a signal to the Americans that this is not what they want. They do want to come to an understanding, despite the record of duplicity that there has been in the past. And I think that a far-sighted government in Washington might understand that and might build on it and move forward and agree a compromise. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say on this very vexed topic. Now, let us turn to someone else, because, of course, there is a third party involved in all of this, and that is, of course, President Zelensky of Ukraine. And he has given an interview to The Guardian, which is classic Zelensky. Parts of it, I don't think they border on the irrational. I think they are completely irrational. They are also entirely manipulative. Every part of this interview continues to be incredibly, bizarrely manipulative. Sometimes also you do get the odd admission of reality, the odd bits and glimmers of reality does seep through. So, for example, Zelensky admits that unless the United States gives security guarantees to Ukraine, any security guarantees given by the Europeans are going to be worthless. He is absolutely right about that. The Europeans, left to themselves, have no means and no capability, as they very well know, to enforce security guarantees to Ukraine, given to Ukraine, security guarantees against the Russians. Europe does not have that level of capability. Amongst the Western powers, only the United States does. Now, that is not a reason for the United States to give Ukraine security guarantees. I have already said that if the United States were to give Ukraine security guarantees, the Ukrainians would ensure that at some point they called on the Americans to fulfill those security guarantees and to enter into a direct confrontation with the Russians. One of Zelensky's advisors, close member of his team, Mikhailo Podolyak, actually recently went on, I think it was Ukrainian television. You can find the interview on the internet if you look hard enough, in which he actually said what a wonderful thing it would be if Ukraine could somehow arrange for a direct military confrontation between Russia and the United States. It's quite an extraordinary set of comments that he made, and it demonstrates the utterly reckless and irresponsible policies and attitudes that you find amongst the leaders in Kiev, including Zelensky himself. So, the Europeans cannot give Ukraine security guarantees. It would be extremely dangerous for the United States to do so, given the nature of Zelensky's government, and by the way, any other Ukrainian government that were to emerge now. Just saying. This issue of security guarantees and their existence or lack of them, by the way, brings me back to the key point. Since it is only the Americans who can afford to give Ukraine security guarantees, and since it is no longer in American interest to give the Ukrainians security guarantees, if the United States wants to bring this war in Ukraine to, I won't say a satisfactory conclusion, but at least to a conclusion that continues to allow the United States full freedom of action and does not impact on American core interests, then what the Americans need to do is forget about the Ukrainians, but to come directly to an agreement with the Russians, which hopefully will mean that the Americans don't have to give the Ukrainians security guarantees, because they can rely on their agreement with the Russians to preserve whatever is left of Ukraine. Just saying. But anyway, Zelensky, as I said, he did acknowledge at least this reality in this interview with The Guardian. But he said all sorts of other completely extraordinary things. Let's turn first to the irrational one. He said that in negotiations, he wants to swap the territory in Kursk region for territory in Ukraine that the Russians currently control. The Russians, directly after Zelensky said that, published a strong statement, you can find a copy of it in TASS, saying that Russia is not in the business of agreeing land swaps. As far as the Russians are concerned, all of the territory in contention, Kursk region, the 4 regions, Crimea, they are all Russian territory. Russia is not in the business of swapping one part of Russian territory for another. Put that aside, there is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to swap one small town, which is Suja, and a few villages for any valuable territory in Ukraine that they have gained control of over the last 3 years. And it is a grotesque fantasy to think that. In fact, what Zelensky has just said, that Ukraine is looking to swap Suja for, well, who knows? He said that he wasn't able to say what territory that the Russians control he would take in return for giving the Russians back Suja, but the speculation is that he's got the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in mind, and perhaps even more territory beyond that. Anyway, put that all aside. What Zelensky is basically saying is that Ukraine is going to go on fighting indefinitely to cling on to this territory in Kursk region, these small villages, this small town, because the Ukrainians need that in the future negotiations in order to achieve this land swap. In other words, Zelensky has condemned thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk region to an indefinite battle to cling on to a small place, Suja, and a few villages, because he says that it's his trump card in negotiations. That is absurd. It is grotesque. It shows again a complete disconnection from reality. It shows a complete disconnection from reality about the actual situation in Kursk region, about which more shortly. But the casual way in which he is committing Ukrainian soldiers to an indefinite battle in Kursk region really demands a response. And of course, he didn't get it from his interviewers from the British newspaper, The Guardian. Just saying. Anyway, that's the irrational part of Zelensky's interview. But there is also the incredibly mendacious and manipulative part as well. The part which, again, must reinforce the Russian belief that he is an impossible person to negotiate with, and which the Americans also need to keep track of. Because, of course, Zelensky, to no pushback from The Guardian, his interviews from The Guardian, gives now his own completely mendacious account of the Istanbul negotiations. He denies that he was talked out of the Istanbul deal by Boris Johnson. He says that the reason he pulled out of the Istanbul deal was firstly because it was never fully agreed. Well, that is true, though his team did initial it, and it was hailed, including by the negotiators at the time, I will come to that in a moment, as a breakthrough. And he did make public comments at the time about the importance of sticking by. But he said that the situation has changed. The Ukrainians had just won the great battle in Kiev, and that the events in a certain suburb of Kiev, which concerns about the platform prevent me from naming, that also played its role. And then he also slips in the actual key admission, because he said that one of the factors that actually caused him to pull out of the Istanbul Agreement was not Western pressure. The West didn't pressure him to pull out of the Istanbul Agreement. Boris Johnson didn't tell him to pull out of the Istanbul Agreement. One of the reasons was that the Western powers were not willing to give Ukraine security guarantees. It's there in the interview. And that, of course, was the whole key to it. The fact that there was not going to be security guarantees provided by the West, in effect, destroyed the whole agreement. The words in The Guardian are these: perhaps even more problematic was the fact that although several Western politicians urged Ukraine to make a deal, none was willing to provide security guarantees to back it up. Security guarantees were an essential part of the Istanbul Agreement. The Russians were going to provide security guarantees. The Western powers were also supposed to provide security guarantees. The point was that Boris Johnson, before he visited Kiev, as the London Times at the time confirmed, telephoned Zelensky and informed him that the Western powers were not prepared to give Ukraine security guarantees, because if they did, that would in effect give the Russians, reward the Russians for what the Western powers were saying was a war of aggression. The agreement, the Istanbul Agreement, was unacceptable. And then again, according to Zelensky, he says that without the Western security guarantees, Ukraine was left to rely on Russia's word. After the events in that suburb, that seemed like a bad idea, and therefore that was the reason, one of the reasons amongst several, why Ukraine didn't move forward with the Istanbul Agreement. Again, this is simply wrong. It's not just not having the security guarantees from the West would not just have left Ukraine facing Russia by itself, which, by the way, would have been a serious concern in 2022. A Western refusal to provide Ukraine with security guarantees, as set out in the Istanbul Agreement, would have signalled Western rejection of the Istanbul Agreement. In other words, the Western powers actually said to the Ukrainians, we're not prepared to support Istanbul, we're not prepared to give the security guarantees that we're required to give under Istanbul, and that in effect killed the deal. So Zelensky says, wasn't Boris Johnson that persuaded him to pull out of the deal? Western pressure played no part in it. And then at the same time, he provides the information, which in effect confirms that it did. He also says all sorts of other things. He claims that the Ukrainians had driven the Russians from Kiev. In fact, the Russians withdrew from Kiev. He claims that there was large parts of the agreement that had not been sorted out and agreed. That, of course, is true. But then I remember reading in the Financial Times at the time elaborate briefings given to the Financial Times by Zelensky's own negotiators, in which they hailed the Istanbul Agreement as a breakthrough. You go back, you can probably find those articles in the Financial Times from late March, early April. They're probably all there. So anyway, the Russians will be reading all of this and they will be saying to themselves, well, this man is a liar. He's giving a completely false account of the Istanbul process, even whilst contradicting himself and admitting at some point the truth. He is irrational. He's talking about Kursk in ways that makes absolutely no sense. And when he's talking about wanting security guarantees from the Americans now, he still wants to involve the Americans in a conflict with us. This man is impossible. We cannot possibly deal with him. We can only deal with the Americans. The Europeans are useless. It has to be the Americans, or there is no point in this at all. And that is, I suspect, the general Russian view on all of the discussions that are taking place at the moment. Now, various Russians have been speaking recently. Lavrov, for the record, has just spoken about contacts between the Americans and the Russians. Importantly, he did not confirm or deny that there has already been a conversation between Putin and Trump. But he said this: regarding the direct question about communication, President Trump has repeatedly affirmed his readiness to make phone calls and meet in person. When asked about his reaction to such statements from the US leader, President Putin indicated that he is also open to this. As you might expect, the decision will ultimately be made by the presidents themselves. I have no doubt that the relevant information will be provided. I have no doubt that the relevant information will be provided. Lavrov then repeated himself. He did then go on to say that it's quite wrong to think that the entire world is waiting with bated breath for a Putin-Trump summit. Do you really think the whole world is expecting it? It seems to me not the whole world. There are those who think that any communication between Washington and Moscow kind of infringe on their interests, but clearly that doesn't involve the whole world. And then he also had some things to say, not, as one can imagine, favourable things to say about Kaja Kallas, the Europe's High Representative on Foreign Policy. And he said that they have apparently felt what place in the world hierarchy they have relegated themselves to. It will not be easy to get out of there. In other words, that the Europeans are horrified at the idea that the Americans and the Russians might deal with each other and come to an agreement over their heads. By the way, I've said this many times, but there's now an article in the Financial Times by Sylvie Kaufman, editorial director and columnist at Le Monde, which actually says as much. Trump is forcing Europe to a reckoning on Ukraine. The worst nightmare of leaders on the continent is a deal between Putin and Trump done over their heads. And that's the subtitle. And we then go on to read The French president's worst nightmare, shared by many of his counterparts, is a Russian-American deal done over the heads of Ukrainians and Europeans. An American diplomatic tradition which, to be fair, predates Trump. And it goes into huge amounts of details about this, because more than anything else, by the way, quite apart from the fact that the Russians and the Americans do have the power to decide on the future security architecture of Europe, and they can do so directly with each other. Doing it will demonstrate how marginalized European leaders have now become, the extent to which they no longer count in not just world affairs, but even European affairs anymore. For the record, I'm getting reports of growing panic across Europe. I spoke yesterday about how some people in Russia are interpreting some of the latest moves in the Baltic states, the talk about closure of the border between the Baltic states and Russia, the calls on citizens of the Baltic states to return to the Baltic states in case the border is closed, the talk about seizing Russian ships in the Baltic Sea, the fact that the Baltic states have now switched themselves off from the Russian electricity grid. Well, some Russians, commentators in newspapers, nationalist newspapers like Radovka, for example, are saying, is this a sign that some kind of military action against Russia in the Baltic states is being planned? I'm now hearing, by the way, that there is the identical panic on the other side. I received a whole series of reports about how in Germany, for example, there is now growing fear of a crisis in the Baltics, that if Ukraine falls, the Russians will move on the Baltics, about how Germany and the other European states are in no condition to defend the Baltics, about how the military in Germany is in a state of panic about the situation. And by the way, I've heard similar reports from Britain that there is a curious mixture in Britain of panic and complacency. Still a belief in some places that all will be well in the end, that the Russians will cave, that the supposed problems in their economy are so insurmountable that they will trigger some kind of capitulation. An absurd piece of wishful thinking, by the way, but apparently there are still people in Britain who believe that. But there are also others who are getting increasingly alarmed about the drift towards confrontation with Russia. And of course, all of this panic in Germany, in Britain, in France. Sylvie Kaufmann talks about, well, she doesn't talk about panic in France, but you can see that within Macron's circles, something close to panic is also there. The fear is that the Europeans could be left dealing with the Russians without the Americans. That the whole policy of keeping the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in, set out by Lord Ismay when NATO was founded back in the late 1940s, that whole approach is about to fall apart. Well, there it is. We are looking at a complex situation. Meanwhile, the situation on the front lines continues. Now, in my program yesterday, I didn't have time to talk about the situation on the front lines. There's been some really concerning news from Kursk region. The Russians, a couple of days ago, recaptured the village of Nikolaevo-Darina. Of course, they say liberated. And the Russian Defense Ministry is now claiming that whilst that village was controlled by the Ukrainians, the entire male population was massacred. Now, let me stress, it's the Russians who are saying this. I don't know one way or the other. But when allegations of this kind are made, it is absolutely going to affect thinking in Russia. It's going to harden attitudes in Russia. If Russians believe it, then it's going to have an effect in Russia. And of course, it is going to harden the stance in negotiations, any potential negotiations with the Americans, for example. At the very least, the Russians are going to also demand not just presence of their people in any part of Ukraine that remains outside Russia, but it will also mean that the Russians will be even more determined to achieve a cleanup of the situation in Kiev, and perhaps, for all I know, the Russians will demand that the people who were responsible for these kind of actions will be brought to account. Anyway, this is an important event, and it will have consequences going forward for any negotiation process that takes place now. But moving beyond that, it does seem as if the Russians are now at least some of the way towards the capture of Sverdlikovo, a village to the west of Nikolaevo-Darina, place which these events that I've just discussed apparently took place. The Radovka, as I said, is claiming that Ukrainian defenses are very fierce in Sverdlikovo and the nearby village of Lebyedovo, but that once these two villages are captured, and this article assumes that these two villages will be captured, then communications between Ukraine and its forces in Kursk will have become impossible, because the Russians will be able to control the only important road from Ukraine to Sudzha and to the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region. And going back to Zelensky's words, the fact that he refuses, obviously, to withdraw troops from Kursk region, because he's now saying he needs Kursk region to agree this land swap. These events, these military developments, it seems to me, eventually make the establishment of some kind of cauldron for the Ukrainian forces in Sudzha and in the villages around it all but certain. Zelensky is going to resist every demand to withdraw those troops, and the Russians are now coming very close to the point where they're going to cut them off. Now, if we're talking about the situation in the north, in Kharkiv region, the group of forces north have said that they've successfully repelled all Ukrainian counterattacks in the Volchansk area. It looks as if the Russians are continuing to expand their bridgehead west of the Oskol River. And by the way, there's also reports that they have either captured or are in the process of capturing the village of Yampolovka further south, close to Liman, on the Zherebets River as well, across which the Russians have also established a bridgehead. I suspect that sometime in March, the Russians will be pushing forward from there, and they will be mounting an offensive on Liman and on Slavyansk and on Kupiansk and Izium. this could very well be the big battle we're going to see play out in the spring, prior to the last big battle in Donbass, the battle to capture the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. Elsewhere, there's been less news from Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, though the Russians seem to be in firm control now of Toretsk and all of the surrounding area, and they apparently continue to advance in Chasiv Yar. And I saw a report in TASS saying that with the fall of Toretsk, the clearing of Chasiv Yar is now going to gather speed. In the Pokrovsk-Selidovo area, the Russians have been advancing more rapidly. There appears to be a significant Russian advance westwards from the recently captured town of Velikaya Novoselka. It looks as if the Russians are now advancing towards the town of Gulyapolye in Zaporozhye region. In doing so, it seems to me that that is a strong indication that the Russians intend to capture not just Gulyapolye, but Orekhov as well, another important town controlled by Ukraine in Zaporozhye region. And the point about the capture of those two towns, Gulyapolye and Zaporozhye, and Orekhov, is that they open the way for the Russians to advance not just to the Dnieper River, but also to the city of Zaporozhye itself, one of the major industrial cities of Ukraine, city which once had a population of over 1 million people. And it looks to me as if the Russians intend to capture it. And elsewhere, further north, again in the Pokrovsk area, the Russians continue to advance westwards. It seems that they've now either captured completely or have mostly captured the village of Andreevka. The Andreevka fortified area appears to be collapsing, and the Russians continue to advance west from Selidovo. Now, there's been a lot of commentary and argument and controversy about what is happening in the villages of Kotlino and Udachnye, close to Pokrovsk. And Dima at the Military Summary Channel has said that the Russian troops there are having problems with their communications, that the soft ground means that the Russians cannot send armored vehicles into this area, and that Ukrainian counterattacks have cut off some of the key supply roads. And he thinks that the Russians might be pushed back from Kotlino and other villages, and that it's possible that that has already happened. Now, I have to say that official Russian commentaries, I say official or semi-official Russian commentaries, do not fully support these claims. An article that I saw a short time ago in Redovka said that these counterattacks that the Ukrainians had launched had failed, that the Ukrainians had attacked in penny packets, and that the Ukrainian counterattacks had been unsuccessful. And yesterday, the head of the Donetsk regional government, Denis Pushilin, gave an interview to Rossiya 24 television, in which he appeared to say that the Ukrainian counterattacks had failed. In the Pokrovsk area, we saw the enemy attempting to counterattack, but that did not result in anything positive for him. We see that currently the Russian armed forces are fully in control of the situation. Now, I am not there. I do not know exactly what is going on. Maybe the Russians are having supply problems in Kotlino and Udachnye. I would not be surprised, in fact I think it highly likely that they will resolve them fairly quickly, especially once the ground hardens and once they have redeployed significant forces to this area, as they perhaps will. But it is not unusual in this war for the Russians to pull back from locations that they have briefly captured, but which they find it would be too costly to hold in the face of Ukrainian counterattacks. I don't think this makes any difference. I think that in time, the Russians will be back. If they do pull out of Kotlino, they will very quickly recapture it. I remember that back in the spring, a place called Terny on the Zherebets River, the Russians were supposed to be trying to capture it, and there was an awful lot of commentary and excited discussion about the fact that the Ukrainians had pushed the Russians back there, and there was supposed to have been a destruction of a large Russian armoured column moving towards Terny. I thought at the time that a lot of the commentary about this was overstated, and sure enough, now Terny is under Russian control. I remember again also in the spring there'd been bitter battles north of Avdiivka for two villages, Stepovoye and Berdichi, and there were encounter battles, and sometimes the Russians seemed to have the initiative and sometimes the Ukrainians. But of course, eventually and in time, the Russians captured Berdichi, and Stepovoye and Berdichi are now not only firmly under Russian control, they are far behind Russian lines. So, yes, who knows? Maybe the Ukrainians will achieve some tactical success in Kotlino. I'm not saying they will, by the way. In fact, if I have to make a guess, I would have thought it unlikely, and Pushilin is saying that they have not. But let's say the Ukrainians do. What difference in the end is it going to make? None. The Russians will be back. They will take Kotlino. They will take Udachnya. They will take Uspenovka, another village nearby, which, according to some reports, they have now captured, and which could, if true, means that they're close to sorting out their supply issues. But, in war, this is what happens. There are attacks and counterattacks. It is the big picture that is really important. And the big picture says that the Russians are advancing, and that they're advancing all across the contact line, and that the situation for the Ukrainians continues to get worse. Further illustration of that fact is that over the course of last night, there was another massive Russian missile strike against Ukraine. These have now become so routine that they happen and people don't even talk about them. The conflict in Ukraine is heading ever faster towards the inevitable military outcome. Whether there will be a negotiation before that happens is an open question. There are good reasons to doubt that it will, but that is the only question about the war that remains. Anyway, this is where I finish this rather long video. Let me repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to join your subscription and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.